Mrs. Evelyn James stepped out of the taxi, gripping her small purse tightly as she adjusted her scarf. The city was busy as usual, cars honking and people rushing past, but she didn't let the noise bother her. She had lived in this city for decades, seen it change and grow, yet some things remained the same, like the way people treated others based on appearances. She sighed, shaking off the thought, and focused on her reason for being there. She needed to withdraw some money to pay for repairs at home. It was a simple task, one she had done many times before. As she walked up the steps of the Grand Bank building, she couldn't help but admire how polished everything looked. Gleaming glass doors, fancy chandeliers inside, and employees dressed in sharp uniforms. It was a place of importance, a place where people handled their business with professionalism. At least, that's what she expected. The moment she stepped inside, she felt a shift in the air. The bank was crowded, customers lined up at various counters, some sitting in waiting areas while others spoke to bank staff. As Mrs. James moved toward the teller line, she noticed a few glances in her direction. Quick, assessing looks. She had seen those looks before. Some were just curious, others dismissive, but she didn't pay much attention. She wasn't here to cause trouble. She just needed her money. After a few minutes, it was finally her turn. She stepped up to the counter and smiled at the young teller, a woman in her mid-20s who barely looked up from her computer screen. "Yes?" the teller asked, her voice flat and uninterested. Mrs. James kept her warm smile. "Good morning, dear. I need to withdraw some money from my account." The teller sighed, barely hiding her impatience. "Do you have your account number?" "Oh, I believe so," Mrs. James said, opening her purse with slightly shaky hands. She pulled out a small folded piece of paper where she had written her account details. "Here it is." The teller took the paper and typed in the number, glancing at the screen. Her expression didn't change, but the way she looked at Mrs. James now held something else. Doubt. "Do you have identification?" she asked. "Of course, dear," Mrs. James said, reaching for her ID. It took her a moment to find it, her fingers moving carefully through her purse. She knew she had placed it inside, but her old hands weren't as quick as they used to be. The teller sighed again, louder this time, tapping her fingers on the desk. People in line behind Mrs. James shifted impatiently, some muttering under their breath. Finally, Mrs. James pulled out her ID and handed it over. The teller barely glanced at it before giving a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll need you to verify some security questions," she said. Mrs. James nodded, expecting this, but the way the teller spoke made her uneasy. She had been a customer at this bank for years, yet something about today felt different. Mrs. Evelyn James nodded patiently as the teller asked her the first security question. "What was the name of your first pet?" She smiled as she remembered. "Charlie. He was a golden retriever, such a good boy." The teller barely reacted, simply typing into the computer before asking another question. "What is your mother's maiden name?" "Johnson," Mrs. James answered without hesitation. The teller's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She glanced at the screen, then at Mrs. James, her expression tightening. That's not matching our records." Mrs. James frowned. "Oh dear, that can't be right. I've had this account for years. Maybe there's a mistake." The teller sighed, clearly impatient. "I'll try again, but you need to give me the right information." Mrs. James pressed her lips together. She was certain she had answered correctly. Still, she stayed calm, watching as the teller typed something again. Behind her, the line of customers grew longer. She could hear quiet grumbles and sighs from people waiting. A man behind her muttered, "Why is this taking so long?" Another huffed, shifting his weight impatiently. The teller finally shook her head. "I'm sorry, but I can't process your request. Your answers don't match." Mrs. James blinked, surprised. "But that's impossible. I've given the same answers for years. I can't help you." The teller said, her tone sharp. "Maybe you should come back with someone else to assist you." Mrs. James felt a pang of humiliation. She had handled her own banking for decades. Why was she suddenly being treated like she didn't belong here? "I need to speak to a manager," she said, keeping her voice steady. The teller rolled her eyes slightly but waved for someone. A man in a suit, the branch manager, walked over. He was tall and stern-looking, with neatly combed hair and glasses. He glanced at Mrs. James, then at the teller. "What's the issue?" he asked. "She's failing the security check," the teller said. The manager gave Mrs. James a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Ma'am, if your information isn't matching our records, we can't authorize a withdrawal." Mrs. James stood her ground. "I have my ID. I have my account number. I've been banking here for years. Something must be wrong with your system." The manager sighed. "Ma'am, we have strict policies. If we allowed just anyone to withdraw money without proper verification, we'd be risking security breaches." "I am not just anyone," Mrs. James said firmly. "This is my money." The manager's expression hardened. "If you cannot verify your identity properly, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Mrs. James felt a wave of disbelief. "You're asking me to leave?" "Yes, Mom," he said, glancing at the security guard near the door. "We have other customers waiting." Mrs. James' heart sank. She had never been treated this way before. Slowly, she gathered her things, her hands shaking slightly, and turned to leave. As she walked out of the bank, a deep sadness settled in her chest. She had never felt so unwelcome in a place she had trusted for so many years. Little did the bank employees know, they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Mrs. Evelyn James stepped out of the bank, feeling a deep ache in her heart. The humiliation weighed on her like a heavy stone. She had never expected to be treated that way, especially in a place where she had been a loyal customer for years. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the way they looked at her, the way they dismissed her as if she didn't matter. She walked slowly to the bench outside, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her phone. For a moment, she hesitated. She had always prided herself on being independent, handling things on her own. But today, something felt different. This wasn't just a mistake, it was disrespect. And she wasn't going to let it slide. With a deep breath, she dialed her son's number. The phone rang twice before Michael picked up. "Mom, are you okay?" His voice was warm, filled with concern, just as it always was. Mrs. James tried to keep her voice steady. "I'm fine, dear. I just had a little trouble at the bank." Michael's tone immediately sharpened. "What kind of trouble?" She sighed. "They wouldn't let me withdraw my money. Said I failed some security questions, even though I know my own information." Silence. Then Michael asked, "Did they treat you with respect?" Mrs. James hesitated. She didn't want to worry him, but she also didn't want to hide the truth. "No, son. They were rude. Dismissive. The manager asked me to leave." Michael's voice darkened. "They kicked you out?" "Yes." Michael took a slow, deep breath. "Which bank was it?" Mrs. James gave him the name and location. She heard the quiet sound of him typing something. "Mom, don't go anywhere. I'll handle this." She frowned slightly. "Michael, you don't have to." "I do," he interrupted gently. "You shouldn't have been treated that way." She knew there was no point in arguing. When Michael set his mind on something, he followed through. After ending the call, she sat on the bench, watching people pass by. She thought about Michael, how hard he had worked, how he had built his career from nothing. He had always been determined, never letting obstacles stand in his way. She had raised him to be strong, kind, and fair. Now she had no idea what he was about to do, but she knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let this go. Inside the bank, the employees continued their work as if nothing had happened. They had no idea that the man who was about to walk through their doors would change everything. Michael James stepped out of his sleek black car, his face calm but his eyes sharp with focus. He had always been a man who believed in fairness and respect. His success in life had never made him forget the values his mother had taught him: kindness, humility, and standing up for what was right. But when he heard that his own mother had been disrespected and humiliated, he couldn't just let it go. Dressed in a tailored suit, Michael walked up the steps of the bank with quiet confidence. The moment he entered, the air in the room seemed to shift. The employees continued their work, unaware of who had just walked in. But some customers glanced at him, sensing the authority in his stride. He didn't rush. He observed. He wanted to see firsthand how this bank operated. The same teller who had dismissed his mother was now attending to another customer, speaking in the same impatient tone. The manager, who had asked his mother to leave, was standing near the back, engaged in a conversation with another employee. Michael walked straight to the front counter and spoke to a teller who wasn't occupied. "I need to speak with the branch manager," he said, his voice polite but firm. The teller, a young man with glasses, hesitated. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" "No," Michael said, "but I believe he'll want to speak with me." Something in his tone made the teller uneasy. Without questioning further, he hurried off to get the manager. A moment later, the branch manager appeared, adjusting his suit as he approached. He had the same professional but slightly dismissive air he had shown earlier. "How can I assist you today, sir?" he asked, his voice smooth but businesslike. Michael extended his hand. "Michael James." The manager shook it but still looked unsure. "And what can I do for you, Mr. James?" Michael gave him a small, unreadable smile. "I believe my mother was in here earlier today." The manager's face barely reacted, but Michael caught the slight flicker in his eyes. "Oh, yes," Michael continued. "Evelyn James, elderly woman, came in to withdraw money." The manager cleared his throat. "Ah, yes, I remember. There was a slight issue with her account verification. We have strict policies, you see. We couldn't confirm her identity." Michael nodded slowly. "And that's why she was asked to leave." The manager hesitated. "It wasn't like that exactly, sir. We have security measures. We can't just allow." Michael held up a hand, silencing him. "Tell me something. Do you treat all your customers that way, or just the ones who don't look important?" The room had gone quieter. Some employees had started paying attention, sensing something was happening. The manager's confidence wavered slightly. "Sir, I assure you, we follow protocol." Michael's next words made the manager freeze. "I own this bank." The manager's face went pale. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at Michael, as if he hadn't heard him correctly. "You own this bank?" he finally stammered, his voice quieter now. Michael remained calm, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I own a majority stake in the bank's parent company, which means, in a way, I own this branch too." The manager swallowed hard. The employees nearby had stopped what they were doing, their eyes widening in shock. Some whispered to each other, realizing they had just witnessed a major shift in power. Michael let the silence hang in the air for a moment before speaking again. "I came here today not as an owner, not as an investor, but as a son. A son whose mother was disrespected and humiliated in an establishment she trusted. An establishment that, as it turns out, I have a significant influence over." The manager opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked around as if hoping someone would step in to save him. But no one did. Michael continued, his voice steady but firm. "My mother is an elderly woman who came here for a simple transaction. She has been a customer for years. Instead of assisting her with patience and respect, she was treated as if she was a problem. She was spoken to rudely. She was dismissed. And worst of all, she was thrown out as if she didn't matter." The manager's forehead was now damp with sweat. "Sir, I deeply apologize. We had no idea." Michael tilted his head. "That she was my mother." He let out a small, humorless chuckle. "And if she weren't my mother, would she still have been treated that way?" The manager had no answer. His silence was an answer in itself. Michael took a slow breath, controlling his emotions. "I don't run my businesses this way. Every customer matters. Whether they walk in wearing a business suit or simple clothes, whether they struggle with technology or move a little slower than others, respect should not depend on someone's appearance. The employees shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had been part of a terrible mistake. Michael's gaze hardened. I want to see every security recording from today. I want a full report on how customers are treated here. And I expect immediate changes. The manager nodded quickly. Of course, sir. I will personally ensure. You won't, Michael interrupted. You've already shown me your leadership style. The manager paled further, understanding the meaning behind those words. Michael straightened his suit. My mother deserved better. From this moment forward, this bank will operate differently. I'll make sure of it. The employees watched in stunned silence as the realization settled in. The man they had ignored, the woman they had dismissed, had more power than they had ever imagined. And now, things were about to change. Michael left the bank shortly after his confrontation with the manager. He didn't need to say more. His message had been clear. As he stepped out into the cool air, he could feel a sense of relief wash over him. His mother had been wronged, and now it was up to him to ensure it didn't happen again, not just for her, but for everyone who walked into that bank feeling powerless or overlooked. He made a few phone calls, his voice calm but firm, as he instructed his team to gather all relevant information about the branch and its operations. He knew it wasn't just a matter of firing a few people or reprimanding the manager. It was about changing the culture of the place, about ensuring that respect and dignity became the cornerstones of their customer service, no matter who walked through the doors. Back at the bank, the employees were still processing what had just happened. They had heard rumors about Michael James over the years, his success, his generosity, his reputation for being fair, but none of them had ever expected the owner to show up like that. The manager, now visibly shaken, retreated to his office. His thoughts raced, trying to process what this meant for his career, his future with the bank. Inside the staff room, whispers spread quickly. Did he really say he owns the place? One employee asked. His mom was kicked out. By us? Another said, incredulity in their voice. The reality of what had happened slowly sank in. They realized they hadn't just made a mistake. They had made a serious error, one that had exposed flaws in their judgment and professionalism. Meanwhile, Mrs. James was at home, sitting quietly in her living room. She had returned from the bank earlier, feeling emotionally drained, but also oddly empowered. Her son's words over the phone had given her hope that the situation would be handled properly. She trusted Michael. He had always taken care of things, always made sure that people were treated fairly. Even when she wasn't sure of what he would do next, she knew it would be the right thing. The next morning, Michael's assistant called her. Mrs. James, your son has requested that we take a few steps to make this right. He's also scheduled a meeting for you with the bank manager later today. Mrs. James was surprised but grateful. I don't need to meet him, dear. What's important is that something changes, she said softly. It's not just about me. It's about making sure no one else feels the way I did yesterday. Michael's assistant assured her. That's exactly what he's planning to do, ma'am. He's already started looking into training programs for the staff and discussing ways to improve customer relations across all branches. Later that afternoon, Michael sat in his office, going over the reports and documents he had requested. He looked at his phone, considering calling his mother to update her, but he didn't want to add to her worries. He was taking care of everything. He had always believed in using his resources to help others, and this situation was no different. It was personal now, but it was also about doing right by all of the bank's customers. He wasn't going to let this lapse in service be something that just disappeared. When Mrs. James arrived at the bank for her meeting, she was greeted with unexpected warmth. The manager, his face apologetic, led her to a private room where they discussed the events of the previous day. He apologized profusely, promising that this incident would not be repeated. I've already been told about the changes that are coming, Mrs. James said. I just hope they really stick, and it's not just talk." The manager nodded. "I assure you, Mrs. James, we're taking your concerns seriously. Your son's actions have already begun to inspire real change here." And as Mrs. James sat in that room, listening to the manager's reassurances, she felt a flicker of hope. Things were changing, not just in the bank, but in the way people would treat her and others in the future. It wasn't just about having power. It was about using it wisely, with care, and making sure that others never felt as she had. Michael had made sure of that. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the bank began to shift dramatically. Michael's efforts were not just focused on fixing the immediate issue, but on ensuring that the incident with his mother would lead to lasting change. He understood that it wasn't enough to make a single apology or reprimand a few employees. The heart of the matter was deeper. There was a culture of indifference, and that needed to be addressed at every level. He arranged for a series of meetings with the bank's top management, including the branch managers, customer service representatives, and other staff. Michael had a clear vision. The bank was going to focus on genuine customer care and compassion, and that started with a complete overhaul of their training programs. Each employee, from the tellers to the higher-ups, would now undergo a course on empathy and active listening. Michael believed that customer service wasn't just about handling transactions. It was about making people feel seen and heard. His personal experience, watching his mother be treated with such disregard, made him realize how easily people could become invisible in the eyes of others, especially in environments that were supposed to serve them. Meanwhile, Mrs. James had been invited to attend a special event hosted by the bank. It was part of a new initiative aimed at rebuilding trust with the community. The invitation, which was hand-delivered to her by Michael's assistant, came as a surprise. "We'd like to honor you for your patience and the lessons your experience has taught us," it read. She wasn't sure how to feel about the invitation. A part of her still felt uncomfortable with the idea of being put in the spotlight. But then she remembered how she had felt walking out of the bank days earlier. The shame and the frustration. And she realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about proving that even small acts of disrespect could lead to big changes. She agreed to attend, more for the message than for any recognition she might receive. The event was held in the bank's spacious conference hall. As Mrs. James entered, she was greeted warmly by the staff and many of the bank's customers. It was clear that the atmosphere had changed. People smiled at her, and there was a sense of genuine apology in the air. Michael stepped forward, taking the microphone. "Thank you all for coming. Today we are here to make amends, to reflect, and to take responsibility for how we treat every person who walks through our doors," he began, his voice strong and sincere. "My mother, Mrs. Evelyn James, has taught us all a valuable lesson in dignity. No one should ever be treated as less than human. And this will be a bank where respect is given freely, without hesitation." The applause that followed was loud and heartfelt. Mrs. James felt a flush of warmth rise to her cheeks, though she was still a bit shy about being the center of attention. She looked around the room, seeing not just employees and customers, but a group of people who seemed determined to do better, to be better. Over the following weeks, the bank implemented numerous changes. Customer service policies were updated to reflect the new values Michael had set. Employees were encouraged to be more proactive in helping those who needed assistance, especially elderly customers like Mrs. James. Every branch across the city was given a thorough review to ensure that similar incidents would never happen again. The word quickly spread. This wasn't just a small change. It was a transformation. Mrs. James, now a regular visitor at the bank, noticed how much more pleasant and patient the staff had become. No longer did she feel like an outsider, struggling to be heard. Instead, she was treated with the same kindness that everyone deserved. She found herself smiling more often when she entered the bank, appreciating the new sense of community and respect that now defined the space. And as for Michael, he knew this was just the beginning. While he had made sure the bank was headed in the right direction, he was committed to ensuring that kindness, respect, and fairness would remain at the forefront of everything they did. It wasn't just about making his mother proud. It was about making sure that everyone who came through those doors felt valued, no matter who they were. In the end, the story of one small act of injustice had turned into a larger movement for change. And it had all started because one son decided that his mother deserved more than the world had given her. It was a story that would inspire others for years to come. Weeks passed, and the changes at the bank were undeniable. The staff, once indifferent, now greeted every customer with a smile and a willingness to help. Mrs. James, though still humble and reserved, found herself increasingly impressed by how far things had come. The bank was no longer a place where customers were treated as just another number. It had become a space where people were valued, their concerns listened to, and their needs addressed with care. One afternoon, as Mrs. James walked into the bank to make a simple deposit, she was greeted by Lisa, one of the tellers who had once been so impatient with her. Lisa's smile was genuine, and her tone was warm. "Good afternoon, Mrs. James. How can I help you today?" she asked, her eyes filled with sincerity. For a moment, Mrs. James paused, surprised by the shift. She had always appreciated the politeness of the bank staff, but now it felt different. It felt real. She smiled back and replied, "I just need to deposit this check, dear. Thank you for asking so kindly." As Lisa processed the deposit, they exchanged a few words, and Mrs. James noticed something new in the air. A sense of connection, of mutual respect. It was the same feeling she had noticed when Michael had brought her to the bank's community event. But now it was a feeling that permeated the entire space. The walls, the counters, the floors, they no longer felt cold or indifferent. They felt welcoming, even comforting. Later that day, Michael stopped by the bank to check on the ongoing changes. He was greeted warmly by the staff, and his eyes were drawn to his mother, who was sitting in a corner of the bank, reading a book as she waited for her transaction to be completed. He approached her with a smile. "Mom, how's everything going?" he asked, sitting beside her. His tone was relaxed, as if he hadn't been the one to change everything. As if he hadn't been the one to make it all happen. Mrs. James looked up from her book, her face lighting up when she saw her son. "It's lovely, Michael. I've been noticing the difference." She paused, as though considering her words carefully. "People seem kinder, more patient, and I don't feel so invisible anymore." Michael's heart swelled. This was exactly what he had hoped for. He hadn't done this for praise or recognition, but hearing his mother's words was the validation he needed. It wasn't about big, flashy gestures. It was about the small, quiet moments that made life more bearable. The moments when people treated each other with decency, no matter who they were. As they sat there, talking quietly, Michael couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had led them to this point. It hadn't been easy. There had been challenges, moments when things felt uncertain, even hopeless. But in the end, it had been worth it. Not because he had owned the bank, but because he had used that power to do something meaningful, something that would ripple out to affect more lives than just his own. He looked over at the staff, who were busy helping other customers with the same respect and patience he had once feared would be lacking. They had been taught the value of kindness, of understanding that every person had a story, a need, and a right to be heard. And it was a lesson that, despite its simple nature, would last for a long time. As they left the bank together that day, Michael and his mother walked side by side, no longer feeling the distance that had once been between them and the world around them. It was as though the world had softened, just a little bit, and for the first time in a long time, Mrs. James felt that, no matter where she went, she would be seen. She would be heard. She would matter. And as the doors of the bank closed behind them, Michael knew that the change they had sparked was only just beginning. It was a story that, though rooted in a small moment of injustice, had the power to change more than just a bank. It had the power to change the way people treated each other, one simple act of kindness at a time.